I promised you a video where we would dissect the article that you have been assigned to read about the summary of the argument and invention of the white race by Theodore W. Allen. And so here we are. I'm working from a Word document that I prepared by cutting and pasting the text of the article from the link that you've been given. I put it into a Word document and sort of formatted it so that it's a little easier to walk through. So you will see as I'm talking that the paragraph numbers are larger, making them easier to identify. I have increased the size of the headings and separations and sections of the essay to make it easier to understand. In certain areas where there's a term that I thought might be unfamiliar to you, I've inserted a comment, and really if you will just hold your cursor over the area in pink, then more information about that particular note will pop up for you. In some cases, it's a definition. In some cases, it's a definition along with more article information and the link to that. In some cases, it is an explanation of who a person was, so that for example, Edmund Burke, he's mentioned several times, so it's good for you to understand why, who was this man, so why is his name coming up all of the time. Okay, in your article, and when I did my cut and paste, this followed through with formatting, you have at the end of some paragraphs numbers that are end note numbers. Well, they are as hyperlinks, which will take you to the source. It takes you back to the original article and to that particular end note. The end notes are at the bottom of the page, the way where they typically are. And so there are 123 of those, and I think there are maybe like 10 pages of notes. So where your article says that it's 32 pages, it's not 32 pages of text. It's really only 23 pages of text because the rest of those are footnotes or endnotes. So it's not as bad as you think it is, though you probably are thinking 23 pages is a lot, but it's not really a lot. So, all right, let us begin. In the first paragraph, the way historians will write articles like this, scholarly articles, is by establishing their theorem, establishing the point of what they were exploring, what they were curious about, and then getting into how they decided to pursue that line of inquiry. So we're looking at an essay that summarizes a much larger work. Allen wrote a 2-volume book, huge, and this essay is just kind of shrinking that. It's presenting a historical treatment of a few precisely defined concepts. Now, concepts are ideas. So what does this mean? Why am I highlighting it? This means he is reaching back into established canon of history, and he's narrowing his conversation to the invention of whiteness, but he is working from settled fact and respected theory. So what's already been defined. So he is not re-arguing any concepts. He is taking those and pulling them forward, and then extrapolating out and working out from that. So a few defined concepts, one of which is the essential nature of the social control structure of class societies. Now keep in mind, we're in minority studies, and right now at the beginning, we're trying to understand how did minority status begin? Because I don't know if you learned this in American history or not, hopefully you did. In the beginning, the Africans that were already here on the continent were not enslaved. In the beginning, there was not slavery. There was a time when you had Africans that were on equal status with everybody else. There was a time when there were no white people in North America. And even when there were, there wasn't this distinction of class and society. So this is something that was decided upon and implemented. So when we're talking about social control, keep in mind that with minority status and defining minority, the word power and control is essential to distinguishing people or systems that are that are in a minority in comparison with others that are more dominant or are in the majority. Racial oppression without reference to phenotype factors. And so phenotype takes us to the life sciences. And so you move to your right over here and you see your definition. Phenotype is observable physical or biochemical characteristics of an individual organism determined by both genetic makeup and environmental influences. For example, height, weight, and skin color. So phenotype, that's the definition of that. But racial oppression, not considering the biology of it, is what he's referring to here in this second clause. Then the next clause, because there's a semicolon, of racial slavery in continental Anglo-America as a particular form of racial oppression, because there are other forms possible. And again, as a historian, he's narrowing his focus to the racial slavery in this continent that was a form of racial oppression. And then finally, of the white race and all class association of European Americans held together by racial privileges conferred on laboring class European Americans relative to African Americans as the principal historic guarantor of ruling class domination of national life. So this big long clause here in this really long sentence, which looks like a paragraph, but it's really a sentence, is saying the white race, which has the racial privilege that began by bestowing privileges on those that the working class that came from Europe, and making a distinction between those people and those that were of African descent or that came from the countries in Africa. And the main distinction was that one was going to be superior to the other, one was going to be dominant over the other. And the European Americans were given that dominant status. So this is what the essay is talking about. Okay. He spends the next section talking about the concept of race. I want you to read the whole thing, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that paragraph. I think you're fine by yourself on that. On the third paragraph, the assertion that opens chapter 1, volume 1 of the book. However, and this is in quotes, one may choose to define the term racial. It concerns a historian only as it relates to a pattern of oppression of one group of human beings by another. This is important. If you're taking sociology, the definition of racial might be a little different. You're in a humanities course now. He's a historian. And so he's letting you know what the definition is for him as a historian coming to this concept of the term racial and what it means. When you're writing essays, these are the kinds of things that it's important to do so that people will understand not only what you're saying, but why, what is your argument, your building argument? How do you, upon what is your foundation? The fourth, excuse me, fourth paragraph. When, therefore, a group of human beings from multiracial, which he's letting you know that that concept of multiracialism is an anthropologist term, comes from the discipline of anthropology, not history. Europe goes to North America or South Africa and there, by constitutional fiat, incorporates itself as the white race. That is no part of genetic evolution. This is a convoluted way of saying that the fact that the Europeans designated themselves as the white race was a decision. It didn't have anything to do with genetics, it didn't have anything to do with DNA. Thus, it lies within the proper sphere of social scientists and is an appropriate objective for alteration by social activists. Okay, section 2 on race as a social construct. I have highlighted the names W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, and Langston Hughes, so that if you are not familiar with these individuals, these are names that you should be familiar with. W.E.B. Du Bois, you probably do know from American history. Quite often there's the debate about what it means to be Black in America as seen through the eyes of Booker T. Washington versus how it's seen and perceived through the eyes of W.E.B. Du Bois. James Baldwin was very, very active as an essayist and actor during the 1960s and 70s. And so he's a very provocative speaker and predominant essayist. Langston Hughes, so he really was the most contemporary of the three. Langston Hughes, time-wise, chronologically, is between Du Bois and Baldwin. Langston Hughes expressed himself more through essays, but more through poetry and through short story and novel. And he is more commonly associated with the Harlem Renaissance. So this was the early part of the 20th century. Okay, let's move down. These are definitions. So we're outlining the social class. Hegemony is a term that you really should know from American history, but I did not want to assume that, and perhaps you haven't taken your college history yet. So hegemony refers to leadership and the predominant influence exercised by one nation or one group by another. So first you have, in terms of a social structure, there has to be a beginning, a foundation, and then a middle, and then a top if you don't have anything else. So first there's the ruling class, and that's the part of the social structure that has power. Okay. It will maintain domination over the national economy through successive generations and social crises. And so if you think in the United States of America, now we have our families, our major families that have consolidated wealth, and their power has been consolidated over time. We had a president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The Kennedy family was at one time a very, very dominant political force. So one of the sons was a president. Two of the sons ran for the presidency. One of the sons had become Attorney General of the United States. Another son retired from the Senate in Congress, and well, he didn't retire. I'm sorry, he died. But that they were a political bloc, and that's a long time to have a sphere of influence. So I'm using them as an example because the Kennedy name is one you might know. We have the Bush family, who is another political family that Texans most certainly know. They are split between Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, and the state of Texas. But of course, we have one President Bush that lives here in Dallas, and then the other family is in the Hill Country, and so there's a deep, deep, deep tradition of of influence and dominance in certain areas in governmental legislative circles and power. Okay, when you have the ruling class that is able to limit the options of social policy in such a way as to perpetuate its hegemony. So there are certain situations where you will have either families or blocks or groups of people or institutions that have a lot of power and they just don't want to let it go. So they will just have a death grip on it and they will shape policy. There was the financial crash of 2008, and the hedge fund. It was part of that was the hedge fund crisis, and that was what middle class America refers to as Wall Street. Well, it wasn't all of Wall Street. It was one particular sector of Wall Street. But as far as the average person was concerned, it was the entire financial and banking system. Well, that they have a tremendous amount of power. With it, that's where our checking accounts are. That's where our paychecks go and direct deposit. It's really it's much easier to live life in this country with a bank account than it is without a bank account. It's just more cumbersome when you don't have one. It's hard to avoid financial institutions. And so because of that, then there's a lot of power over policy that goes along with that, which is why a lot of the policies with lending do not favor people like you and me as much as they favor the financial institutions. So, okay. Moving to the next paragraph, there's the intermediate buffer social control system. Classically, it's composed of self-employed small landowners or leaseholders, self-employed artisans. Artisans would be like craftspersons, like maybe welders or artists or furniture makers, people that work with their hands and create their own stuff. Members of the professions, that would be like me, who live in relative economic security in subordination to the ruling class and normally in day-to-day contact with their social inferiors. Okay, so we're in the middle. And then there are those people who do not have productive wealth. Their value is rooted in their ability to work, and which lets you know that there's a big problem when you have a percentage of people that, for a variety of reasons, are not able to work. One of the problems with homelessness is that there are homeless people that are getting up and going to work every day. All it takes to be rendered homeless is to have your house burned down. And if you don't have family living here that you can go and stay with for at least a minute, you're homeless. There are people that there are all kinds of reasons that lead to people being homeless. But if you're unemployed and you're homeless, there's a bit of a problem getting a job because most employers want you to have an address. You can't just have a phone number. You have to actually have a physical address. And so there are all kinds of things that can get in there and make life a little bit more challenging. The lower one goes down the rung of the social classes. Okay. Edmund Burke, I highlighted this because his name keeps appearing in this essay, and I wanted you to know why. He is so important. He was a political theorist, and he also was considered to be the father of the contemporary conservative movement, or the father of conservatism. So, okay, let's move down to number 14. The hallmark, the informing principle of racial oppression in its colonial origins, and as it has persisted in subsequent historical contexts, is the reduction of all members of the oppressed group to one undifferentiated social status beneath that of any member of the oppressor group. And this directly matches, though the wording is different, it matches what is in your chart of definitions and characteristics of minority groups. Somebody has to be on top. And for somebody to be on top, that means that somebody else is not. Okay, the section on the African Americans, there's a section on African Americans, a section on Native Americans, and a section on the Irish. Again, I have highlighted the names of individuals that we should know from studying American history, but in case you do not, then I've heightened those. The daughter of an Igbo king. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Igbo people, and it's going to be a little challenging for you to find it under that spelling, because now there are variants of that spelling, and you will find it as IBO more often than you will find it as EBO. And for our purposes, in terms of what's available to us for that deep African history, they are one of the largest single ethnic groups in the continent of Africa. And please remember that when we're talking about Africa, we're not talking about a country. There are 54 countries in the continent of Africa. It is really massive. The Igbo people were mostly consolidated around the area of Nigeria and the surrounding environs. And so, to give you a little bit more historical background on the Igbo people, I've given you this link here in the corner. That's a hyperlink. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to skip to compelling parallels. Now, once again, you need to read all of this and read the part about the American Indians, read the part about the Irish, in particular about the Irish. Irish people that know their history and Irish Americans will quickly tell us that the Irish were really horrendously treated when they were first here. And that is true. They weren't treated that much better than the Africans were. That much is true too. The Irish were not enslaved. So that's a big difference. But that does not mean that the Irish were treated well, because they were not. And they were not generally well regarded. So make sure you read and learn more of the details about just how horrific it was for the Irish. This section on compelling parallels is sort of doing like a comparative analysis of those three. So this is assuming that you've already read about the African Americans, the Native Americans, and the Irish Americans. Take note here, number 27, that in the beginning of the 18th century, the word Negro meant slave. This is not something that we are really taught. We're taught that the word Negro is a nice word to use rather than the N word when referring to people. But in the beginning, it translated, so to speak, as slave. And so calling someone a Negro meant that they were not free. That was the purpose for the term. Hibernicus was used, it translates to Irishman. That was the legal term for unfree if you were talking about the Irish. So if someone was a Negro, then that meant they were a slave. If somebody was a Hibernicus, then that meant that they were Irish, but they were not free. So they were probably indentured servants. Look here that now you're learning that the rape of a female slave was not considered a crime. And the reason it was not considered a crime was because the female slave was the property of the master. And so it was sort of like the marriage laws, that a husband could not rape his wife because it was her duty to satisfy him on demand. The same was true, even more so, for the slave, because it's like, I own you, so you don't have the right to say no. Therefore, how could it be rape? And this is what's important to realize here, is that this was legal. This wasn't just practice. This was had a foundation in the law. in 12, two Anglo-Normans brought into court and charged with raping Margaret O'Rourke, which today would be spelled Rourke, but the spelling here didn't have the U. She's Irish. Were found not guilty because she was Irish. So that's how lowly the Irish were on the totem pole, that the woman, you could rape her just because she was Irish. That you didn't need another reason. So she was a Hibernicus, okay? Which is just, it's just amazing to me. Scrolling down, I've highlighted, and keep in mind, each one of these takes you to a footnote that will take you to documents that will support that and give you more information. The Georgia Supreme Court ruled in 1851 that the killing of a Negro was not a felony, but upheld an award of damages to the owner of the African American bond labor murdered by another white man. Okay. Indians were legally like immigrants, and therefore they were not citizens except by a process of individual naturalization. And let that sink in, because this is their country, this is their home. So the colonization results in, not only did we slaughter and we took everything, this isn't really your home. It's like you were never here and ruling everything. You are worse than an immigrant, which lets you know how immigrants were perceived. And then the Irish were immigrants. The Irish were regarded by English law as foreigners in their own land. Testimony by free African Americans was not considered to be creditable. Now we're talking free African Americans, not slaves, but you were still black. So your word had no value. You couldn't be considered as a credible witness. So testifying in court, well, that was just an absolutely ridiculous concept. In Anglo-Norman Ireland, native Irish of the free classes were deprived of legal defense against English abuse because they were not admitted under English law. So in other words, they just didn't have any rights. It didn't really matter what was done to you by the ruling class. You did not have a rebuttal. There was nothing that was on your side. There was just you, and you were fighting something really, really huge that was designed to keep you in at the level that you were. That is institutionalized oppression. That's what that is. So Protestant ascendancy and white supremacy. Okay, I've given you definitions of oligarchy, and we're hearing the term oligarch in the news now in connection with some cases that are receiving a lot of national attention. So, oligarchy is a small group of people having control over a country, organization, or an institution. Something has been indemnified. This word is going to appear on insurance policies. If you ever stop to read your lease, if you're renting, or your property casualty insurance, you're going to see indemnification as a term. That is talking about being compensated for harm or loss. Okay. Plebes, that's an ancient Roman term, and it was meant to refer to a member of the lower class. Another word that I didn't expect anybody to know was vexatious, and that means causing someone to worry or to be anxious or um, um, to frustrate them or to upset them in some way. Then you're being vexatious. Some of the spellings here are really going to be like Old English spellings or English spellings of English. And of course, we're working with an Americanized modern spelling of words, so don't let that throw you. Down at the end of section 29, I know that everybody studied Turner's Rebellion in American history. I've highlighted this. A meeting of white men in Northampton County, Virginia in December 1831, which was shortly after Nat Turner's Rebellion, This meeting, these men took pride in asserting that the Negro was excluded from many civil privileges which the humblest man enjoys. Okay, this was what Nat Turner's rebellion was all about. I've had people say sometimes, "What did he think? How did he possibly think they were going to be successful? How did he possibly think they were going to win?" Sometimes it's a principle of the thing when one is going into battle more so than whether or not you're actually going to win. It's about something being important enough to fight for. And you will find that throughout history in every country and every cause, and there will be a series of significant battles. And you have to follow all of them to get to the ultimate fight. And you will find oftentimes that whoever the side that won had lost a few along the way, but had those skirmishes not occurred, then the end result would have been very different than what it was. Okay, let's move down to There Were No White People Here, section 6. This is where it starts getting even more interesting, I will say. Section 34. When the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people there. The word philology, which I forgot to highlight here, I need to go back and put that definition, so I'll just tell you what that means. Philology has to do with the history of a word. The etymology, when we look in a dictionary, tells us the genus and whether it comes from the Old Greek or the Old French or Latin or that. But the philology gives you the historical usage of the word across time. It's just absolutely fascinating. And the only book that gives us that is the Oxford English Dictionary. And it's just, if you look up the word study in the OED, as we call it for short, it's page after page after page after page, giving you the definition of the word study, but it's giving you when it first appeared, how it was used, and when it changed, and whether or not the spelling changed. It's like, I don't know, it's like reading Lord of the Rings or some other epic like that. It's just fascinating. But that's what philology means. Okay. Highlighting this in 35, during my own study of page after page of Virginia County records, reel after reel of microfilm prepared by the Virginia Colonial Records Project and other 17th century sources, I have found no instance of the official word of white as a token of status before its appearance in Virginia law passed in 1691. Referring to English or other white women. So this was the beginning. The term white just wasn't even there. There weren't white people and other people. There just was not whiteness defined, concretized until Virginia law in 1691. Okay, so think about that. And then think about when Jamestown was founded and how many years it took for that to happen. So what was going on in the interim? What happened? That's a long time. That's like 50 something years. So what were they doing? Why did they decide at this time this is what they were going to do? Moving down to 37. Considering the fact that no more than 1 out of every 4 bond laborers, now bond laborer, we're talking about like your indentured servants, okay, was an African American. Even as late as the 1670s and 1680s, there were a significant number of court-ordered collaborations of African Americans and European Americans in a common endeavor to escape their bondage, of which only a selected few can be mentioned in the space of the sun. So what is that saying? This right here, number 37, I need to put this in red ink because this is like everything. To use our terms and borrow from a once popular TV show that's no longer on, Survivor, the African Americans and the European Americans that were coming in as laborers like that, they were forming an alliance, okay? They were kind of working together because there was no reason for them to be in opposition with one another. Keep in mind, we still are not to the point that there's something called whiteness. We still aren't there. This is the 1670s and 1680s, and pretty much everybody is closer to being the same and kind of equal. I mean, they're not equal, but it's not that racialized the way it's about to become. It's not as bad as it will be. And so they wanted to escape their bondage. So the Africans, it's like they had their own issues. The Irish had their own issues. They weren't bothering with fighting one another. Neither of them were free. And so it's like, ooh, if we pool resources or if we work together, this is going to be, our chances of success are going to be greater. Well, if you're the person that owns them or if you're the person to whom they are indebted, this is not a good thing. That's a threat. And so this is the period of time where the pot starts boiling. There are, if you have not heard of John Punch, then now you're going to know John Punch. I didn't learn about John Punch until I started studying history much, 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 much later. So in June of 1640, you have three of these Virginia bond laborers. There's Victor, who's Dutch from the Netherlands. You've got a Scottish man by the name of James. And then you have a Negro. Now remember, the word Negro meant slave. It meant you're not free. Named John Punch. They escaped. But they were pursued, they were caught, and then they were brought back to trial. And so this made them runaways. These two men, Victor and James, were sentenced to longer indentured servitude. So let's say that they had to work off whatever their indebtedness was, and they had to work another 10 years before they ran away. Then their punishment was extended by 20 years. So they were going to have to work 20 more years instead of 10 more years. But John Punch was enslaved. He did not get the same sentence that the Europeans got. And so this course with John, this case with John Punch became, here it is, became the first time that the court sanctioned this move into slavery. This was it right here. Now, as an aside, there was an article published in 2012 that through DNA research, it has been determined that President Barack Obama's mother, who of course was Caucasian, had African ancestors. John Punch is President Obama's grandfather, 12th generation grandfather, but not on Obama's father's side, where we might assume. It's on his mother's side, and which is always interesting. So this kind of, finding these things, you just don't know where they're going to lead. But this story and this particular case is everything. So John Punch then is sentenced to a lifetime of servitude. A lifetime. So he's enslaved. Okay. Yes, what the record of this case does show, as far as the ideas in people's heads are concerned, is a disposition in the part of some, at least, of the plantation bourgeoisie to reduce African Americans to lifetime servitude. And what put that in their head was this happening here. And it just never, it never reverted back. So moving on down, it was this law that, it's a 1661 law that punishment, additional time and freedom in women. Okay. It was this law being directly and explicitly at free African Americans that explicitly anticipated racial oppression. You still had free Black people, but it was a precarious existence, meaning if luck was on your side, that could work out, but there was no guarantee of that. And the pamphlet, Solomon Northup, who survived to tell this story, that pamphlet, 12 Years a Slave, which is a true story, and I actually bought the pamphlet and read it. The film was made based upon that story. That is a perfect example. Solomon Northup was born free, but that didn't stop the slavers from kidnapping him and then pulling him into the slave system, out of which he could not escape for a long time. I mean, he eventually did, but he didn't escape. He got lucky, and through correspondence and the help of friends that had been looking for him for years, they were able to get him out. Let's see. There's this law that basically says that if you kill a Negro or an Indian, you basically aren't killing a person. Nothing's going to happen to you if you do that. Now, this I highlighted in red because this is what really made slavery so pernicious. The bondage was not only lifelong, but it's hereditary. Indentured servitude did not have that. If somebody is an indentured servant, they pay that off. If they die, then their wife, their spouse, and their children do not assume that debt. But if you're a slave, you're a slave. And the child of a slave, the child of that mother is automatically a slave. So how do you escape that? There's no hope for you to get out of that. It is lifelong, but it also is passed down from generation to generation to generation, which is why we went from a few boatloads of slaves to millions of slaves by the time of the Civil War. Okay. This is going into more detail about how the African Americans were joining forces with the bond laborers, superstructural. I think you're going to be okay here by yourself. Normal class status. Oh, yes. Number 66. In Virginia history is really fascinating because you had this period of time where Black people owned property. You had this period of time where white people married Black people. I mean, they were legally married, and where the wife could inherit the property. And it wasn't everywhere, but it was just really messy in Virginia. They eventually straighten that out. But when you're looking into the history of America, and especially Southern and the racialism, Virginia is very all over the place with that, and just fascinating. There's a term called head right. And that's not a word that it wouldn't surprise me if this was a new word to you. So what does head right mean? Head right means refers to the allotting of certain parcels of land to an individual. It means by the head or per person. Okay, that's why it's called that. And so there was a system of that was in Germany that covered the property owning of African Americans as well. And so your author has just taken a few of these instances and given you some of the details so that if you're really interested in digging in, you can go back. And this is on the internet, so you don't have to buy a book to find this. And keep in mind, these are hyperlinks, and so they take you to where the information, the footnote is, and you can find more. But you can also just Google this and it comes up. So land patent granted to Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was his family was one of the major families and one of the larger landholders in terms of an African American family. Leron Bennett, I highlighted that because it's another African American scholar that whose name you need to know. He's very prominent. Okay. Um, um, Quilombos, those were settlements, Brazilian settlements of runaway enslaved African peoples. So that's another definition. We study Bacon's rebellion in American history, and so this gives you an expanded view on that by the time you read your essay and get to this point. Um, the it, it Bacon's rebellion made it clear that there was a lack of distinction or something in between the ruling class and the European Americans and the African Americans. So after that Baker's rebellion, that's when there became really big efforts to put something down legally that was going to make it kind of impossible for that to happen and threaten those property owners, property being human beings. And the way they did that was really by taking that working class or indentured servants of whites and convincing them that they were inherently better than the blacks. They were just better, and giving them reasons why they were better. And so that was enough to break any kind of alliance that was in the process of being formed, and it also permanently put that rift and separation there. And we're still suffering with the repercussions of that strategy. Okay. Okay. So this sentence here is important because he wants you to realize that by the time you've read down to this point, that is misspelled. Hang on. Okay. Right before about a century before the Nat Turner's rebellion, you just had people fighting side by side for the abolition of the idea of enslavement or owning people, and that changed. But for a while there was an agreement. Okay. So he summarizes by saying, surely that was no unthinking decision. Rather, it was a deliberate act by the plantation bourgeoisie. It proceeded from a conscious decision in the process of establishing a system of racial oppression, even though it meant repealing an electoral principle that had existed in Virginia for more than a century. So, the establishment of a system of racial oppression. So when we say that racism is institutionalized in the United States, it is. It's not myth. It is, and that's just reading from the history. It was created purposefully and has been nurtured and sustained. Is this something that can be changed? Yes, but that takes the population to decide that they're ready to tackle that. And again, do battle, because there would be a battle, so that that could be righted. So, okay, I hope this was a little helpful in kind of breaking this down. Now, again, you have to read the essay. This is not excusing you from reading the essay, but hopefully it makes it a little bit more or less daunting as you read. Okie dokie.